Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm taking a look at Juggernaut. The patches as of late haven't really been that interesting to test, and it's kind of just bogging me down because most of the changes that uniforms or characters are getting are just minor number increases, maybe some stats moved around, shifted around, and not really improved significantly enough. And it's almost getting to the point where the uniforms are becoming cosmetic. So that kind of sucks, and I thought that this patch would basically be more of the same because, as expected, they didn't really give Juggernaut penetration on his iframe ignore, which was the major effect that everyone was looking forward to make the character viable at high level of PvP. Instead, they gave him something like reduction to reflect damage, which is nice, but that penetration either to the iframe ignore or the passive is really the effect that would have put him over the top, and I would have instantly recommended getting the uniform and upgrading the character if he got that, but that is not the case. However, I honestly thought that Juggernaut would be the second coming of Hulkbuster, just Hulkbuster 2.0, where he was just absolutely useless and just sat there and couldn't really penetrate any shields or defenses or anything like that and just ended up dying. But that surprisingly wasn't the case, and he is a lot better than I expected. The major difference between Hulkbuster and Juggernaut is that Juggernaut actually has some really strong stats, and he does have penetration in his kit. It's just on the awakening skill, so you kind of have to build him in a way where you can utilize that to be able to take out characters that are much stronger than him. I'm obviously talking about PvP here, and that's mostly what I'll be focusing the review on. His performance in PvE is average, if not lackluster, so I'm not really going to be taking much time in that part of the review. To give you a reference point where Juggernaut was at in PvE, I went into a stage 35 of Null using his old uniform, no leaderships or supports, and I was able to finish that stage with around 50 seconds remaining, which shows you that the character isn't really meant for PvE, especially because he has damage accumulation based off damage taken, which didn't really change with the new uniform. Because the new uniform changes his typing from supervillain to superhero, I had to go into a stage where I could use both of those uniforms, so I went up to a stage 50 again without using any leadership or supports, and with the old uniform I was able to complete the first phase with around 2 minutes and 40-ish seconds remaining. With the new uniform, I surprisingly did worse. I completed the first phase with around 2 minutes and 20 seconds remaining, or just about. But that could also be a factor of the character having damage accumulation or based on damage taken, which makes it a lot trickier to have consistent results, because if it was just damage dealt that the accumulation filled up, then I don't really have to worry about just standing in pools of damage and things like that. So that could be one of the factors, but regardless, the character isn't really meant for PvE anyway. When I upgraded Juggernaut to level 80, I was able to complete the first phase about a minute faster, and with the upgrade I was able to complete the stage entirely and did so with around 40 seconds remaining. I wouldn't recommend you build the character for PvE, but if you don't really care about PvP and maybe he's one of your favorites and you just want to use him in PvE, then I would recommend going with the CTP of competition first because he doesn't have guaranteed crit. But if you don't have that, you could always go with the CTP of rage. I wouldn't recommend you go with a single skill damage proc like an energy or destruction because his skills aren't really proc friendly. In terms of the skill rotation, you would want to open with the third one and probably just stay in the third skill for the majority of the duration, because you don't want to immediately go into the fourth and fifth skill since they are iframes and you will be avoiding taking damage, whereas you do actually want to take damage and hits so you fill up your damage accumulation buff. So open with the third skill, just stick into that, and then go into the fourth skill. You can delay cancel after he kind of hits the ground the first time, and then you can go into your fifth skill. When you have your awaken skill, you can just tag that on to the beginning of your rotation and just immediately cancel it, and then follow the rotation as is. So you go 6, cancel 3, and then 4, delay cancel 5. If you have access to your tier 4 skill as well, you similarly want to use that at the start before your rotation so that you can get the damage buff from it and fill up the tier 4 skill faster. Ideally, you also want to quick cancel the first and second skill or use them as filler when your other skills are on cooldown. So the tier 4 skill is actually good for Juggernaut. It gives him an attack increase and a damage increase when the opponent is under 50% health. And this often coincides with his Awaken skill because it's filling up as he's surviving. So by the time it reaches around 30 seconds, or if it does reach 30 seconds, he will activate the Awaken skill, and by that time his tier 4 skill will usually be up or available, which means that it can allow for that Awaken skill to basically hit like a nuke and do a ton of damage. Besides the tier 4 skill being useful, one of the other factors that makes Juggernaut useful for PvP is his massive stat increase with the tier 4 upgrade. He gains almost 22,000 physical attack increase, which is, I believe in some cases, more than some native characters, and his HP increase is also just ridiculous. It's pretty much 45,000 for me, which again is more than some native characters. The defense increase is good too. It's around 8,000 and 9,000 respectively for energy defense and physical defense. That does play a factor for Juggernaut specifically because his playstyle is more leaning in towards survival, which is one of the reasons why that 45,000 HP increase is so massive and probably plays a bigger factor than the 22,000 physical attack increase, but that is also important when that Awakened skill goes off. In terms of the striker for the character, you're mostly going to be looking at ones that have penetration, iframe ignore, and probably super guard break, so that when it activates, it can actually help him out a lot. It can lock down the opponent with the super guard break. The penetration would obviously also help because he doesn't have it outside of the Awakened skill, and the iframe ignore is obviously also important because you want to hit them regardless of what skill they're in, whether it's an iframe or not. If you want all of those effects, you'd likely have to move one of those top strikers to Juggernaut, since you probably are already using them for other characters. That would be ones like Wolverine, Spider-Man, Carnage, Quicksilver. But if you want a striker that has the same matching instinct type, then you can use Shalabal, assuming that you have that character unlocked and built up. The only thing is that with Shalabal's striker skill, she does have 100% penetration on it, which is great for Juggernaut, but doesn't have that super guard break lockdown. I'm obviously talking about PvP strikers here. For PvE, you'd likely just want one that has a matching instinct type, or just a really good one like Ghost Rider, Thor, Black Widow, things like that, but you're probably not going to use Juggernaut in PvE anyway. That said, the tier 4 upgrade did give him a substantial improvement in PvE, and he went from clearing with around 45 seconds remaining to roughly around 3 minutes remaining, which is about a 2 minute and 15 second improvement. With Juggernaut now being tagged as a superhero, he does satisfy one of the restriction days for ABX, but you don't really want to use him there because he just really isn't that good. He doesn't have a high number of hits, which is essential for the character being good for ABX. And although he does have some of the cancel effects, the fact that his damage accumulation is based off damage taken is one of the reasons why he just can't really work there, because oftentimes you're not really going to be taking damage from the Frost Beast. Regardless, if you're wondering how he performs there, I was able to score a pitiful 7.6 million without a damage proc, and with him just at level 80. The tier 4 does give him a decent score improvement, but the tier 4 just isn't designed for ABX or ABL either, because the Frost Beast never goes under 50% health, so half of his tier 4 doesn't even work. It's one of the reasons why the tier 4 isn't as strong as it is in World Boss, where it is a major improvement, whereas in ABX at least, it is a decent improvement, but it's somewhere around a 2 million score upgrade. So I haven't really showcased much to make you want to get Juggernaut, at least on the PvE side. The character is a premium character, so he should technically perform better in PvE as well, but what he does lack in PvE, he does make up for in PvP, especially considering that he is missing one of the major effects that is basically needed for a character to perform well in PvP nowadays, and that effect is obviously penetration in his base kit. But like I mentioned at the start of the video, he still does have penetration, but it's hidden behind his Awakened skill. So taking that into consideration, not having penetration in his kit for the majority of the fight, the character does perform better than expected and can punch up in some major ways depending on how you build him and how you team him up and who you use him versus. I tested a bunch of different CTPs, both at the Mighty and Brilliant level, to showcase that he can function with various builds to a differing degree. but I would still say that the most ideal build option I found was a CTP of Conquest. That doesn't necessarily have to be a brilliant one. I actually used the mighty one for the majority of the testing, but in the Alliance Conquest testing, I ended up going with the brilliant version to see how far I could push his performance. If you don't have spare CTPs of Conquest to go around, because nowadays it seems like that is the best option for every character, I would say that the next best CTP for him would be a CTP of Regen, followed by a CTP of Authority, and then a CTP of Refinement, and then a CTP of Destruction. You'll notice from the list that the majority of the CTPs that I recommended are survivability based ones that just keep him alive longer, because I tested out a Destruction just to give him that penetration straight up from the beginning, but his performance dipped massively because even though he does have a lot of survivability, not having a CTP to augment or boost that up further just made him die pretty quickly and not really do much with that penetration, because the penetration from the Destruction is also a low percentage, so oftentimes it won't even kind of break through their shields or invincible or things like that. You don't really get much value out of it because the top proc doesn't do much for him either. So the basic idea is to get his penetration from his Awaken skill, which is 70% for 7 seconds, and to do that you need to build him for survivability so that he can live long enough for that skill to activate and for him to get the complete effects that he needs for PvP to be able to take out some of the stronger characters that have invincible and things like that he needs to punch through. So outside of Conquest, which was the best performing, CTP of Regen came in second. It provides him with a ton of HP and healing to further boost up his survivability, as well as that shield that can't be penetrated, and him having that penetration effect on the Regen CTP. It's called the same thing, but it's a different effect. It's when it interrupts the opponent at a % chance. That is actually pretty useful for Juggernaut if it triggers, because he can survive some pretty major hits that he couldn't with other CTP effects on the top proc, like the Steel Authority or the Refinement top proc that gives you a ton of healing. Authority comes after Conquest and Regen because you're trading in a lot of the survivability that you would get from the high recovery rate, the HP shield, or the wall effect, and the just ton of healing that you get. You're trading that in for Invincible, and the Invincible effect he already has on his 5th skill that he uses, and the Awaken skill, and oftentimes with top meta characters it can be penetrated pretty easily because they have a very high percentage of penetration. The benefits that you gain from a Steel Authority is that you gain a little bit of extra damage from damage taken, because Juggernaut doesn't really use his 3rd skill really at all, just the 4th and 5th skill on repeat, so that doesn't really overlap. You gain that extra damage, and obviously you gain the immunity to super guard break, so you won't be locked down as often. And if you're lucky enough to get a brilliant version of the Steel Authority that can go up to 60%, Juggernaut already has 40% damage reduction in his passive, so you can get pseudo immortality every 5 seconds or so to help you survive to the Awaken skill. A CTP of Refinement follows after these CTPs, and I genuinely thought it would have been better, and it's still not a bad option, but the major downsides of the CTP are that it doesn't really provide any offensive capabilities whatsoever. Not that the Regen did, but the Regen does provide better survivability than the Refinement, because one of the other issues with the Refinement is that he doesn't gain any kind of guard break immunity, so you can't really spam the 4th skill if you're constantly just being locked down by regular skills, not even ones that do super guard breaks. Aside from this, even though the top proc does give you immunity to super guard break, it can activate in a time that doesn't really benefit Juggernaut, unlike the other CTPs. A Conquest top proc will always benefit him when he gains the damage increase. A Regen will always benefit him if it activates or triggers. The Steel Authority will always benefit him by giving him that pseudo immortality. But for Refinement, that top proc could activate when he's almost close to max health and just give him a little bit of extra healing and nothing else. He could just take a massive amount of damage right after that, and it won't really help keep him alive. And Destruction is the worst of these options because you're trading too much for too little, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. The other differences between the Conquest, Regen, Refinement, and the Authority is that the Conquest also provides you with total immunity to reflect damage, which makes him even more viable versus reflect characters, whereas the other options don't really do that. Regen and Refinement to some extent help with reflect, because you gain that additional healing to help counteract the damage you're dealing, but Conquest is still the most ideal option overall. Keep in mind that I only tested a Mighty Conquest in Timeline. I didn't even compare the Brilliant version to these other CTPs, so already at the Mighty level, the Conquest CTP just ended up performing more consistently and better than these alternative options. As I mentioned, the Conquest obviously provides immunity to Reflect fully, so not only is he less susceptible during the time that the top proc isn't active, but when it does activate, then he gains full immunity, so you can actually use Juggernaut as a good counter versus characters that do Reflect damage because of that. If you've noticed from these gameplay clips and from what I've mentioned, Juggernaut's rotation is to primarily go into the 4th skill as soon as possible, and then follow up with the 5th skill. Sometimes he'll go into the 2nd skill, but primarily he sticks with these 2 skills, and both of these are iframe skills, with the 4th being a very long iframe skill and the 5th one being a slightly shorter one. But both of these also help him not take reflect damage unless the opponent also has iframe ignore to knock him out of the skills to deal damage back to him, so oftentimes he also has that extra layer of protection versus reflect characters. This is one of the many reasons why Juggernaut is as tanky as he is. The others are that he has that 40% damage reduction passively, he has passive healing, he has active healing, and I actually just noticed that he has 2 instances of invincible. He also has 2 seconds of invincibility on the 2nd skill as well as the 5th skill, and he also has it on the awakened skill that I mentioned earlier. The active healing is on his iframe ignore skill, so he's always spamming that, getting a lot of healing back, and he also has 20% all defense as well as an additional 60% all defense when he goes under 40% health, which actually also removes all debuffs or CC effects on him outside of you having a leadership that does that as well. So if he's locked down and drops under 40% health, then he'll get all of his debuffs removed, and that is on a 5-second cooldown, so it will activate again after a while and it goes under that 40% health again, so it really helps keep him up and constantly spamming that 4th skill to heal back. His passive also gives him super armor and another 20% all defense, and his uniform passive gives him 30% HP on top of the massive amount of HP that he also has just as a base character and from getting him to tier 4. If you actually use Juggernaut in the leadership position, you can gain an additional 50% all defense. So if you add all of those together, you would basically get 150% increased defenses if you had Juggernaut in the leadership position and taking into account his passives, active skills that give him that defense increase, and the procs on his other passive. Keep in mind that this goes to 170% when the awakened skill activates, because that also provides him with a buff, and the character going through the 4th and 5th skill kind of moves around a lot. The 5th skill repositions him constantly, so he is avoiding a lot of characters that can only target to a certain range, or that leave kind of pools of damage on the ground. Because he's kind of moving around, he can avoid that to some degree. So the Conquest obviously complements him greatly because it gives you that damage reduction shield that stacks up with his high already passive damage reduction that you can also stack up even further if you add in sports. You gain that recovery rate, which is really key for his survival because he already has high HP. So if you can max out the recovery rate as much as possible, he's healing a ton of HP every second because that HP pool is so huge. He obviously also gets the HP proc on the Conquest, which further improves his overall healing and survivability, and having that top proc give him a damage increase is nice, but the major improvement that the Conquest provides is that he not only has the base guard break immunity, but also the super guard break immunity when that top proc activates. So he has both of those immunities, so he can constantly keep spamming that 4th skill and get that healing from the iframe ignore skill activating, and going into the 5th skill to gain that invincibility and survivability from that. Juggernaut also has that reduction to reflect that I mentioned, as well as gaining the reflect immunity when the top proc of the Conquest activates. But believe it or not, Juggernaut has even more survivability if you can get his artifact. The artifact isn't as crazy broken or strong as the immortality ones or the ones that provide revive, but it's pretty up there for PvP characters. His artifact provides him with, at least at stage 6 or the max level 1, it provides him with 70% recovery of his HP when he's under 40% health, and he also has his max HP increased by 70% for duration. So that means that when he's low, he'll get back up to pretty much full, and his HP will increase even more, providing him with more healing per second and making him heal faster during that time. Juggernaut will struggle to take out characters that have Invincible either in their kit or their build, and most of the top meta characters will have these conditions. That is the reason why you want to build Juggernaut for survivability, because his Awaken skill is the one that will essentially take out these opponents, and his survivability can be good enough with enough investment, obviously, to survive all the way to the Awaken skill. That's probably one of the other downsides for Juggernaut, is that you are a little bit dependent on RNG if you're facing off versus top opponents, because they could potentially take you out, especially ones that have greed builds. So I wouldn't recommend going up versus those characters. But on top of that, you do need kind of a really built up character for him to tackle some of these stronger opponents. So showcasing here at the end that the old uniform can also function if you aren't able to get the new one, but you don't gain that protection versus reflect characters, so he is more susceptible to dying that way outside of the greed build that the opponent can use. And on top of that, he doesn't linger in iframe skills as much as the other uniform, so you can end up taking a lot more damage in this uniform than the other one. Also, as a note, I would highly recommend you don't take Juggernaut versus Null or Sentry. I only tested him versus some decent build ones at the high level of Platinum and low end of Vibranium to showcase how he performs versus some stronger kits. Ideally, you would want to dodge maybe the top 3 or 4 or maybe top 5 characters, just focus on all the other ones, because he will be quite useful in Alliance Conquest to take those characters out. Juggernaut doesn't really have a place in Timeline. He's mostly going to be an Alliance Conquest character, even in Otherworld Battle and things like Team Battle Arena. There are higher tier characters that you would ideally want to use, but there are chances that you could potentially use him depending on the ban list. The ban list in Timeline will never change, so if you do just want to use him there for fun, you can kind of just roll around because he's so tanky and kind of dodge a lot of the attacks, at least for characters that aren't Sentry and Null. So if you do want to use him there, then ideally you would just do what the AI does for the most part, is to open with the 4th skill so you can get that healing and iframe ignore and hide in the iframes, and then go into the 5th skill if you can to get the Invincible, and potentially also try to weave in the 2nd skill for Invincible or the 3rd skill to get some damage accumulation. For the most part, it's all about just managing your tier 4 skill and your Awakened skill to take out problem characters. So in this case, in this particular fight, it would be Null, so I would save the Awakened skill for him, and also save the tier 4 skill for him and Wolverine, because those are the ones that will just be only killable by using the tier 4 skill for the most part. Silver Surfer, I could manage to take him out without having to use the Awakened skill, but did manage using the tier 4 skill. With Wolverine, it's mostly just going to be luck that he doesn't kill you before you kill him. Alliance Conquest is really going to be the place where you can utilize Juggernaut, and like I said, I would highly recommend you don't try to use him versus Sentry or Null or some of the very top hitters, but regardless, I took him there just to see how he would do, and you could just see how tanky Juggernaut is, because I was able to survive for such a long period of time before he ended up dying. I thought Juggernaut would perform a little bit better versus this all-speed team because he has a type advantage, but one of the other issues that Juggernaut faces is fighting versus opponents that have a lot of super guard break. Because they can lock him down, he can't activate his healing from his 4th skill, the Invincible from his 5th or 2nd skill, and just stay in those iframes to avoid damage. So he's just going to be locked down, take a ton of damage, and just end up dying. Might have gotten a little bit lucky in this particular fight because the Thanos on the opponent team didn't have a good CTP for PvP. They had a CTP of Rage, but despite that, the Thanos wasn't able to instantly one-shot Juggernaut, and Juggernaut was also able to deal with Doom, who also has a CTP of Authority build and all that invincibility. One of the reasons why Juggernaut performed well here is because Doom kind of has a slow build up. He has that counter iframe ignore skill, so he needs to get hit to be able to deal a max amount of damage for that. But Juggernaut is moving around in his iframe, so he is avoiding that damage, and it's gonna burn up the clock and allow him to go into the Awaken skill to take out Doom. I would have thought that Juggernaut would be able to take out the second team as well, but Invisible Woman can potentially lock down Juggernaut with her kind of tier 4 skill and a lot of her effects, and Mr. Fantastic has really high physical damage reduction and can deal a good amount of burst damage with his own iframe ignore skill, so that one didn't really go as planned. The consistency might be a little bit tough versus some characters, but there's no doubt that Juggernaut definitely provides value in Alliance Conquest and can really punch up and take out native characters. He was able to take out Thanos, Doom, and you can see that in this particular test, he's also able to take out Deadpool, which he has a type advantage versus, and even Apocalypse, even when they have the support to boost up their offenses to be able to take out Juggernaut before he goes into his big Awaken skill and tier 4 skill. You can actually see that Juggernaut was even able to survive a tier 4 activation from Deadpool, and if you played close enough attention with this particular lineup that I had, I was able to get somewhere around 1.6 million HP on Juggernaut at the height of all the procs activating. Juggernaut's Awaken skill and skill priority is high enough where he can go into it right away, and because he also has Invincible, he can ensure that he takes out the opponent with all the damage from the Awaken skill before they do the same, which allowed him to take out Quicksilver despite him having Super Guard Break to lock him down, so Juggernaut was immune to that, took out Quicksilver, and then because of the type advantage was also able to do the same to Black Swan. This last clip is to show you just how useful Juggernaut can be if you utilize his skills properly. So in this one, I'm utilizing the fact that he has that damage reduction to reflect damage, so he can't really take much of that, especially with the Conquest, and adding in supports that also decrease the damage he takes and increase the damage he deals allows him to deal with characters like Silver Surfer, for example, and especially because the opponent also had Spider-Man on the team that Juggernaut had a type advantage versus, I was able to take out a pretty solid top meta character, Silver Surfer being arguably in the top 10 PvP, if not top 5 in some cases. And then because I had the Awakened skill after, I was able to take out even characters like Emma because Juggernaut is in iframe and has that huge HP and reduction to reflect, so he doesn't instantly just one-shot himself in that second fight. So if you are interested in Alliance Conquest and are a fan of the character, I would say that he is a pretty solid pickup, but the requirements are that you need to build him a certain way. You do need to build him up pretty at a high level to get the most out of him, and you absolutely do need to get him to tier 4 to get not only the tier 4 skill, but also get those huge stat increases to allow him to survive better and actually be able to punch up like he does for his character's design. It's really unfortunate that the devs didn't give him penetration on the 4th skill or his passive, because the character would be much better and would possibly be pretty scary to deal with, because he basically would have a complete kit. But it seems that nowadays characters are deliberately not given complete kits so they can struggle along, and only the native characters can function at the top level, and sometimes not even them, like characters like Shalabal, who are missing a lot of the things and can have better kits. But yeah, that's pretty much PvP nowadays. Either way, I'm just glad that Juggernaut isn't a complete waste of time or Hulkbuster 2.0. He actually does have some usability, being it as limited as it is, which it should have been better, but honestly, I'll take that over the character just being useless for several years to come. So yeah, if you want to use the character for PvP, Alliance Conquest is his main usage right now, unless any kind of buffs or restrictions change across other PvP game modes like Otherworld Battle or Timeline Battle Arena, but for the most part, it's Alliance Conquest. So if you're not interested in Alliance Conquest, then this is obviously a skip for you, but for the people that are interested, also keep in mind that Mephisto was data mined, and he also has that iframe ignore, penetration, all those PvP effects, meaning that he could potentially function as a PvP character or a PvE one, and he's probably dropping in the next 2 weeks or so. So if you don't have a lot of tier 4 material saved up, and you are interested in Juggernaut, I would probably hold off and kind of wait to see what Mephisto brings before making a decision. That does it for this video. I kept my expectations low, so I'm not completely disappointed, which is kind of ridiculous because I can't really say to buff every character and give them this or that. At this point, they're just kind of ignoring feedback or deliberately are making characters like this. Anyways, if you did enjoy this video, found it entertaining or useful, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this video with others. It could help them out as well, and it helps my channel grow so I can make more videos like this. I say this all the time, but as always, I do appreciate people taking the time to watch my videos. Thank you, but the video is now over.